A soft-spoken nun steps into the high-security infirmary, standing before a man whose eyes reflect decades of cold darkness. She whispers, "I am here for your final rites, Silas. Repent now and find peace before the end." But the prisoner doesn't bow his head. He doesn't pray. Instead, he leans forward, his shackles rattling against the iron bed frame, and rasps, "My last wish, sister. I have a lifetime of blood on my hands, but I will only confess it to you. If you want the truth, you must sit with me in this cell every night until the moment I die." Sister Angel recoils, her hands trembling as she clutches her habit. "That is impossible," she stammers. "I am a servant of the church, not a companion for a condemned man." But Silas locks onto her gaze, his voice dropping to a desperate, haunting hum. "Then let the truth die with me, and let the innocent keep suffering for my silence." Angel freezes. In that moment, her sacred duty wars with her very soul. The guards move in to escort her out, waiting for her to turn her back, but she doesn't move. Did a man of God's house truly grant a forbidden wish to a monster? What she discovered in the dark is a revelation that will leave you absolutely breathless. This is based on a harrowing true incident. Watch until the very end, because the final confession changes everything. If you're ready for a story of secrets and redemption, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss a mystery. Before we begin, comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Let's begin. The sterile, biting cold of the infirmary was broken only by the flickering fluorescent light above Silas's bed. He sat slumped against the metal frame, his body a map of scars and regret. Despite a life defined by violence, there was a haunting, ancient wisdom in his stare, a look that seemed to see right through the prison walls. Miles away, down the quiet, limestone corridors of the convent, Sister Angel walked with a heavy stride. She had taken her vows less than a year ago, yet she had already earned a reputation as the most steadfast, disciplined, and courageous soul in the order. But nothing in her training could have prepared her for the darkness she was about to enter. The heavy scent of antiseptic and stale air clung to the walls of the prison infirmary, a stark contrast to the lilies and incense of the convent Sister Angel called home. She walked down the long, echoing corridor, her black habit rustling softly against the polished linoleum floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the mission pressing down on her narrow shoulders. The warden had been clear. Silas was a man of darkness, a soul that had refused to utter a single word of remorse in 20 years. Yet here she was, summoned by a man who had finally chosen to break his silence, but only for her. As she reached the heavy iron door of the high-security ward, the guard on duty gave her a look of pity mixed with warning. The door groaned open, revealing a room bathed in the flickering, sickly green light of a dying overhead tube. In the corner, chained to a bolted-down hospital bed, lay Silas. He was a map of scars and faded tattoos, his body wasted by the illness that was slowly claiming his life. Yet his presence still filled the cramped space with an undeniable intensity. Angel approached the bedside, her fingers instinctively tightening around the silver crucifix hanging from her neck. She looked down at him, expecting to see the face of a monster, but instead she found eyes that were hauntingly clear, eyes that seemed to be searching her face for a ghost. "I am Sister Angel," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the oppressive silence. "I was told you wished to make your final peace." Silas didn't move, but his gaze locked onto hers with a force that made her breath catch. He didn't look at her with the lust or defiance she had been warned about. Instead, there was a raw, agonizing recognition in his stare. "I told you, sister, I have a lifetime of blood on my hands. But before I go, I'm going to tell you exactly whose blood it really is." He leaned back, his eyes never leaving hers, the silence in the room suddenly feeling like the edge of a cliff. "Only if you stay, only if you're brave enough to hear what the church has been hiding from you." The flickering fluorescent light hummed with a rhythmic, buzzing intensity that grated on Sister Angel's nerves as she pulled a heavy wooden chair toward Silas's bedside. Outside, the prison was alive with the distant metallic clanging of cell doors and the muffled shouts of guards. But within these four walls, the silence felt thick enough to suffocate. Silas lay motionless, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow it barely moved the thin hospital gown. For a long moment, Angel sat in the dark, her fingers tracing the smooth beads of her rosary, wondering if the man had already slipped away. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice startling her. He didn't open his eyes, but a slight tremor moved through his shackled hands. "Most people would have run by now. Most people want to stay in the light." "I am a servant of the Lord, Silas," Angel replied, her voice gaining a strength she didn't truly feel. "There is no darkness I fear if it leads to the truth." Silas opened his eyes, and the sheer depth of the grief within them stopped her breath. He didn't begin with a list of crimes or names of victims. Instead, he spoke of a night 20 years ago, a night Angel had spent the rest of her life trying to forget. He described the smell of the old cedar wood in the orphanage hallway and the way the wind used to whistle through the cracks in the dormitory windows. "I wasn't there to hurt anyone," Silas rasped, staring at the ceiling as if watching a film play out in the shadows. "I was there to fix the boiler, but when the first flame caught the curtains in the east wing, I saw them. Not children, sister. Men. Men wearing the same collars you respect so much." Angel felt a cold chill wash over her. "That's impossible. The fire was an accident, an electrical fault." "That's the story they sold the world," Silas countered, his voice rising with a sudden, desperate energy. "They needed that building gone. There were records in the basement, names, ledgers, proof of what they were doing with the donations meant for you orphans." He turned his head to look at her, his gaze piercing through her defenses. He described the way the smoke had turned the moon red and how a small girl with a silver locket had been trapped behind a jammed door in the inferno. "I didn't kill your mother, and I didn't set that fire," he whispered, his strength fading as he slumped back into the pillows. "I spent 20 years in this cage because I was the only one who saw the faces of the holy men holding the matches. And one of them is the reason you're wearing that habit today." Angel stood up abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her mind was a whirlwind of denial and burgeoning horror. Angel was telling her that her entire life, her sanctuary, her vocation, her very survival, was a lie constructed by the architects of a massacre. As she turned to leave, his voice followed her into the hall, haunting and low. "Come back tomorrow, Angel. I'll tell you the name of the man who saved you." The morning sun filtered through the high, arched windows of the convent, but the light brought no warmth to Sister Angel. Her mind was a chaotic landscape of flickering flames and Silas's gravelly voice. She tried to lose herself in the rhythm of the morning prayers, but the words felt hollow, like bells ringing in an empty valley. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man's shackled hands and heard his accusation. "One of them is the reason you're wearing that habit today." Before she could depart for her afternoon shift at the prison, a summons arrived. It wasn't from the infirmary, but from the warden's office. Warden Miller was a man built of sharp angles and cold efficiency. his office a shrine to order and discipline. He didn't offer Angel a seat. He stood by the window, his back to her, watching the exercise yard below. "Sister, I've been reviewing the logs," he began, his voice clipping each word with clinical precision. "You stayed in that ward 3 hours past your scheduled rotation last night, alone, with a man whose criminal record is a testament to human depravity." He was sharing his confession, Warden. "As a servant of the church, I cannot turn away from a soul seeking penance." Miller turned, his eyes narrowing. "Silas isn't seeking penance. He's seeking an audience. For 20 years, that man sat in silence, mocking this system. Now, suddenly, when the reaper's at his door, he chooses a young, empathetic nun to spin a web for?" He leaned over his desk, his shadow stretching across Angel's feet. "He is a master manipulator, sister. He knows your history. He knows you were an orphan of that fire. He's using your trauma like a surgeon uses a scalpel to cut you open and plant his own narrative." "He mentioned details no one else could know," Angel whispered, her defense mounting. "He was a contractor for the diocese back then," Miller snapped. "He had access to files, floor plans, and names. He's feeding you poison and calling it wine. My job is to maintain the security of this facility, and that includes the psychological safety of its visitors." He paused, his gaze turning icy. "Consider this a formal warning. If your sessions continue to deviate from spiritual guidance into his personal fantasies, I will revoke your clearance. The church elders have already expressed their concerns. They want him to pass quietly, sister, not with a megaphone." Angel left the office, feeling as though the walls were closing in. The warden's words were logical, even protective, yet they tasted of fear. As she walked toward the infirmary, she realized the warning wasn't just about Silas's manipulation. It was a coordinated effort to keep the cell doors shut on the past. But the more they tried to silence Silas, the more she realized that the truth didn't just live in his words. It lived in the very fear of the men who wanted him gone. The heavy iron door of the infirmary felt colder than usual as Sister Angel stepped inside, her conversation with the warden still echoing like a threat in the back of her mind. Silas looked smaller tonight, his skin waxy under the pale light, but his eyes remained sharp, tracking her every movement with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He didn't speak as she sat down. Instead, he gestured with a trembling, shackled hand toward the small, scarred wooden table beside his bed. "You're wondering if I'm the monster they say I am," Silas rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "But monsters don't keep things, Angel. Only men who have lost everything do." He reached beneath his thin pillow and pulled out a small, tarnished object. It was a silver locket, dented and blackened by heat, hanging from a snapped chain. Angel's breath hitched. Her hand flew to the collar of her habit, where a similar locket, pristine and polished, lay hidden against her skin. It was the only thing she had been left with after the fire, a gift from the orphanage directors who told her it had been found in her crib. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't find it in a crib," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. "I took it from the neck of a woman who was trying to crawl through the smoke to get to the nursery. She wasn't an orphan, and she wasn't a nun. She was a witness, just like me." He held the locket out, the metal glinting feebly. "There's a hinge on the side, a secret one. The holy men who raised you never showed it to you, did they? They didn't want you to see the photograph inside." With trembling fingers, Angel took the charred piece of jewelry. Her thumb found a small, nearly invisible notch in the silver. With a soft click, the locket popped open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman laughing, holding a baby with tufts of dark hair. a woman who looked exactly like a younger version of Angel. On the opposite side, inscribed in elegant, swirling script, were the words, "To my bravest witness, never forget the truth." "That woman was your mother," Silas said, his voice thick with a sudden, raw grief. "She wasn't killed by an accident. She was killed because she knew about the ledgers. And the man who saved you from the flames, he's the one who ensured she never walked out of that building." The room seemed to tilt. The locket felt like a branding iron in Angel's palm, a physical link to a past that was being rewritten in real time. The warden's warnings about manipulation faded into the background, replaced by a cold, sharpening clarity. Silas wasn't just a prisoner. He was a living archive of a crime that was erased by the very hands that had blessed her. She looked at the dying man, and for the first time, she didn't see a convict. She saw the only person in the world who had ever truly tried to protect her. The heavy, soot-stained locket felt like a leaden weight in Angel's palm as she walked back to the convent, the charred silver cooling against her skin. The evening bells tolled, summoning the sisters to vespers, but the sound, once a source of profound comfort, now felt like a rhythmic warning. She moved through the stone cloisters like a ghost, her eyes cast downward, avoiding the serene smiles of her superiors. For the first time, the shadows cast by the flickering candles in the chapel didn't feel like the reach of the divine. They felt like a shroud designed to hide the rot beneath the floorboards. That night, instead of retiring to her cell, Angel used her ministry key to slip into the restricted archives of the mother house. The air here was stagnant, smelling of parchment and ancient dust. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she bypassed the theological texts and pushed deep into the administrative records from 20 years ago. According to Silas, the fire was no accident, and the records of the orphanage's donations were the catalyst for the slaughter. By the light of a stolen candle, she began to pull leather-bound ledgers from the shelves. Most were meticulously kept, but as she reached the year of the fire, the entries became erratic. Significant sums of money intended for the care of the hundreds of children had been diverted into special projects overseen by a name that made her blood turn to ice: Father Thomas. He was the man who had pulled her from the wreckage, the man who had presided over her final vows, and the man she had looked up to as a father for 2 decades. Her fingers trembled as she found a loose leaf report tucked between the pages, a floor plan of the orphanage's basement. It was marked with red ink in the very area Silas claimed the fire had started. Beside the marks were initials she didn't recognize, but the handwriting was unmistakable, that of the current bishop. "Looking for something, sister?" The voice was low and smooth, cutting through the silence of the archives like a blade. Angel spun around, nearly knocking over her candle. Standing in the doorway was Father Thomas, his face partially obscured by the darkness, his expression unreadable. He stepped into the circle of light, his eyes falling on the ledger. "I am merely seeking to understand my history, Father," Angel said, her voice barely a whisper as she slid the charred locket into the deep pocket of her habit. "The past is a dangerous place for a soul so young," Thomas replied, stepping closer, the warmth of his paternal smile not reaching his eyes. "Sometimes, in our quest for truth, we stumble into traps set by those who wish to see the church fall." He placed a heavy hand on the ledger, closing it firmly. The sound echoed through the hollow room like a casket lid shutting. Angel realized then that the warden's warning hadn't been a suggestion. It was the first layer of a defense that had been standing since the day she was born. Silas was a dying man in a cell, but the men who kept him there were standing right in front of her, dressed in the garments of God. The confrontation with Father Thomas had left Angel vibrating with a terror that transcended fear. It was a spiritual vertigo. She knew she was being watched, but the clock was ticking, and Silas was running out of time. Ignoring the curfew, she moved through the darkened convent grounds, keeping to the shadows of the stone walls. Her black habit felt like a target in the moonlight, yet it was her only camouflage. She slipped into the infirmary, finding the ward in an eerie, deathly hush. The guards were absent, a rare and ominous lapse in security. Silas lay motionless, his breathing erratic and labored. When she reached his bedside, his eyes fluttered open, milky and distant. "You came, Angel," he whispered, a faint tremor running through his thin fingers. "The shadows are lengthening, Angel. I don't have much time." "I saw him, Silas," she confessed, her voice barely audible over the hum of the medical equipment. "I saw Father Thomas in the archives. He knows." Silas let out a wheezing, mirthless laugh. "He doesn't know everything. He doesn't know what I hid." He motioned for her to lean in, his voice dropping to a jagged, desperate rasp. "You asked about the night of the fire. The records will show it was an electrical surge, but that's a fabrication. I was there, in the basement, trying to stop them." He gripped her hand, his strength surprising for a dying man. "They weren't just burning documents. They were silencing dissenters. Your mother, she had the ledgers. She was going to the police. Thomas didn't start the fire himself, but he made sure there was no way out." "The stick," Angel pressed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recalled the charred artifact. "What about the stick?" "It wasn't a weapon used in a robbery, like the stories say," Silas hissed, his eyes wide and unfocused. "It was a heavy, charred beam from the support structure. Thomas used it to bar the doors of the nursery from the outside, so the fire would consume everything. I saw him standing there, holding it like a cross, watching the smoke rise. He dropped it in the wreckage, knowing it would be buried in the debris, indistinguishable from the other ruins." The truth hit Angel like a physical blow. The man who had carried her out, the man who had become her mentor and father figure, had held the instrument that sealed her family's fate. "Help me, Angel," Silas gasped, his grip tightening until it hurt. "Take my final statement. Record it. If the church won't give you justice, make sure the world hears what was buried under your sanctuary." As she pulled out her small notebook, a heavy, familiar silence descended. The pact was sealed in the dark, the weight of the confession pressing down on her as the only truth left in a world of lies. The ink on Sister Angel's notebook felt like lead as she recorded Silas's raspy, stuttering breath. The air in the infirmary had grown frigid, as if the very presence of the truth was draining the warmth from the room. Silas's eyes were fixed on a point in the distance, his grip on her hand slackening as his life force ebbed away. "They call me a murderer," he whispered, a thin line of sweat glistening on his waxy forehead. "They told the world I was the one who trapped the children. But look at me, Angel. Look at these scars." He pulled back the sleeve of his gown, revealing rope-like burn tissues that climbed all the way to his shoulder, marks of an old, deep agony. "I didn't bar those doors. I was the one trying to pull the beam away. I was the one who fought through the heat until my skin peeled away just to find the nursery." Angel's breath hitched as she looked at the silver locket she still held. "You weren't a prisoner back then," she realized, her voice trembling. "You were just a man who saw something you shouldn't have." "I was a nobody," Silas rasped. "And Father Thomas, he was everything. When the smoke cleared and the sirens arrived, he stood over me. He whispered that if he didn't take the fall, if he didn't sign the confession, he would go back into the ruins. He told me he knew where the little survivor was being kept. He told me he'd finish what the fire started." A wave of nausea rolled over Angel. Silas hadn't spent 20 years in this cage because of a crime he committed. He had spent them here as a human shield. He had traded his freedom, his reputation, and his entire life to ensure that a predatory man wouldn't return to hurt the child who had seen too much. Every night he spent in this cell was a night he had bought for her safety. "I didn't confess to save my soul, Angel," Silas's voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "I confessed to save yours. I knew if I stayed in here, they'd leave you alone. They'd think the witness was dead and the killer was caught." The depth of his sacrifice was a crushing weight. The man the world reviled as a monster was the only true saint he had ever known. He had lived a lie for 20 years to protect a girl who had grown up to wear the same habit as the men who destroyed his life. As the machines beside his bed began to wail a steady, low warning, Angel leaned down, her tears falling on his scarred arm. "I see you, Silas," she whispered fiercely. "I see the truth now. I won't let your sacrifice be in vain." The monitor's steady pulse slowed to a jagged, agonizing rhythm, the sound echoing through the sterile infirmary like a ticking clock nearing midnight. Sister Angel did not pull away this time. She held Silas's hand with a fierce, protective grip, her rosary tangled between their fingers. The man who had been a ghost in the system for 20 years was finally fading, his skin becoming as translucent as the truths he had spent his life guarding. "The light," Silas whispered, his eyes fluttering open one last time. They were no longer the eyes of a condemned predator, but of the tired man who had fought through a furnace to save a child. "It's not red anymore, Angel. It's white." "Rest now, Silas," Angel choked out, her tears blurring the sight of his peaceful expression. "I have the locket. I have your words. The fire is over." He offered a faint, ghostly smile, his chest rising in one final, shuddering effort. "Tell them I wasn't a monster." With a soft, rattling sigh, the tension left his body. The hand that had held hers so tightly went limp, and the flat line of the heart monitor filled the room with a piercing, unrelenting tone. The silence that followed was heavier than any she had ever known. Angel sat there for a long time, the coldness of the room seeping into her bones. She leaned forward and gently pressed a kiss to his scarred forehead, a silent vow passing between the living and the dead. As she stood up to leave, the infirmary doors swung open and the warden entered, followed by 2 guards. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the still form on the bed, and then on the notebook clutched in Angel's hand. "He's gone, sister," the warden said, his voice devoid of empathy. "The church has already made arrangements for a private burial. There's no need for you to stay any longer." "He was an innocent man," Angel said, her voice steady and sharp as a blade. The warden stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "He was a convict who died of natural causes. Whatever fantasies he fed you are buried with him. For your own sake, Angel, go back to the convent and forget this ever happened." But as Angel walked past him, her head held high, she felt the weight of the silver locket in her pocket. She wasn't the same sheltered girl who had walked into this prison a week ago. Silas had given his final breath to ensure she knew the truth, and as she stepped out into the night air, she knew the fire wasn't out. It was just beginning to burn within her. The morning after Silas was buried in an unmarked grave, the convent felt like a tomb of a different sort. Sister Angel moved through the halls with a silent, burning purpose. She no longer bowed her head when she passed the high-ranking clergy. Instead, she watched them, searching for the flickers of guilt behind their pious masks. The warden's warning and Father Thomas's quiet threats had intended to bury the truth along with Silas, but they had underestimated the power of a witness who finally understood what she had seen. Returning to her small, sparse cell, Angel locked the door and pulled the 2 silver lockets from her pocket. She laid them side by side on her desk, the one she had been given, polished and deceptive, and the one Silas had guarded, charred and honest. With a steady hand, she reached into the hidden compartment of the blackened locket and pulled out a small, folded piece of parchment that Silas had tucked behind the photograph. It was a letter, written in a cramped, hurried hand during his final days, addressed not to her, but to the man who had orchestrated their shared tragedy. The letter was a map to the final piece of the puzzle, a safety deposit box in a small town outside the diocese's reach, containing the original ledgers Silas's mother had died to protect. But as she read the final lines, her blood ran cold. Silas hadn't just been protecting her from the past, he had been warning her about the present. He didn't just bar the doors that night to hide the money, Angel, the letter read. He did it because the orphanage was just the beginning. The special projects never stopped. They just moved into the shadows of the cathedral. A sharp, rhythmic knock at her door made her heart leap into her throat. "Sister Angel?" Father Thomas's voice called out, smooth and paternal as ever. "The bishop wishes to see you. He wants to discuss your future and your silence." Angel didn't answer immediately. She tucked the letter and the charred locket into the hollowed-out center of her Bible, the one place they wouldn't think to look. She realized now that the unfinished business Silas spoke of wasn't just a legal exoneration. It was a war. Silas had given his life to buy her 20 years of safety, and now it was her turn to use that time to dismantle the throne of the man who had called himself her father. As Angel opened the door to face the man who had held the beam that sealed her family's fate, she didn't see a mentor. She saw a target. The high-retention drama of Silas's confession was over, but the high-stakes battle for the soul of her church had just begun. Silas was gone, but his truth was finally out of the cell, and it was hungry for justice. Silas passed away in that cold infirmary, a man the world called a monster, but the only soul who truly stood between a young girl and the flames. Now, Sister Angel holds the weight of a secret that could shatter the very world she's sworn to serve. The question remains, when the truth demands everything you believe in, do you have the courage to listen? If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to join our community of storytellers. We'd love to know who you are. Drop a comment below and tell us which part of the world you're watching from today. Stay curious, stay brave, and we'll see you in the next story.